Well, thank you very much. I'm sure you do it as much as I do. It's often the very first thing you do in the morning, and it's the very last thing you do at night. It is checking your phone. The BBC website, the BBC News website, is checked by 18 million people. Check that site 5 times a day. What on earth are they looking for? What are they expecting will suddenly emerge at check number 3 or check number 4 or check number 5? It is a veritable obsession, and this is the feature of my new book, which looks at news not from an industry point of view, as so many books do, but from an audience's point of view. It is, if you like, a piece of literary criticism of the news. I was challenged to write this because of an awareness of how little we are systematically educated into this business of looking at the news. I mean, when we're at school, someone will have a shot at telling us what pictures do to us, how they can influence us for better and for worse. Someone will tell us a little bit about theatre, literature, drama, poetry. But of course, no one really prepares us for the day when we're going to meet with something like this. What does it mean? What's it doing to us inside our souls? It's very bizarre. We get no guidance. And when we come to this, I mean, we're lost. You know, what is this really doing? It's a new age. We're still one of the early generations to be coping with this sort of stuff, right? And there is not systematic attention to what it's doing to our insides. You know, the promise, in the 18th century, the promise of news was enormous. The idea was, if you have free information about the workings of government, about the people, about other peoples, about other countries, if you have a free flow of information, you will lead to an informed citizenry, there will be pressure on legislators, and you will have a flourishing country. Enormous promise of what news was meant to be. I'm not sure if necessarily it's worked out that way. It seems nowadays that if you want to try and keep a population confused, supine, unsure of how to grasp and change the status quo, you've got 2 options. The first option is what you might call the North Korean option. You throttle news. You stop anyone getting any information. That's one way to keep the population confused. But the other way, of course, is far slyer, far cleverer, much better if you really want to try and keep things as they are. You flood people with news, so much news that no one can work out what on earth was happening last week. Does anyone here remember what was on the news last week? Of course you don't. No one does. Because, very cleverly, it's not that we're kept in ignorance, it's that we are flooded with information. So much information, we cannot hold on to the things that matter, and therefore political agendas run into the sands constantly because there is no steady constituency for the very important challenges we face. The German philosopher Hegel said that nations become modern when they replace this with the news, when people stop going to church, when they stop seeing religion as the touchstone of authority, the place that will tell us about right and wrong, the place that will create our sense of what matters, that will deliver our feeling of what we should be aiming for in life. That is no longer, for many of us, the church. It is, of course, the thing that replaces it, in Hegel's eyes, the news. The news replaces religion. It's a very key moment in history. We're way past it now, I think, in the United States, in the UK, and much of Europe. And just as in the area of religion, there are firm believers, there are agnostics, and there are atheists. So too when it comes to the news. And so too if you start to ask questions. Well, boy, you'll run into some accusations of heresy, as I have already done. Be very careful what questions you raise of the media and with whom. But anyway, you will have gathered from my tone that I am more on the more skeptical side of things. Not necessarily a full atheist when it comes to the news, but definitely a little skeptical. Nevertheless, the news has an unparalleled power over us. You get a sense of this whenever anyone wants to start a revolution. You want to start a revolution? Where do you drive the tanks? It's an active question now and at all times, really. Where do you go? You don't drive the tanks to the homes of the novelists, the poets, the social scientists. They're very important, of course, but no one really cares about them, and they don't change anything. You drive your tanks to the news HQ. You always have done. We always will keep doing that, because that is where our sense of reality is formed. That's what you need to control. The person who controls the news controls the minds of the population. It's been true for a while. It continues to be true. Now, what I want to do tonight is take you through a number of areas where I feel the news presents us with challenges, and feel with you towards a slightly better resolution. I'm an optimistic sort of guy. I think the news is not perfect as it is. I want to try and make it better. I want to think with you about how we might do that. Okay, look, one of the things that anyone working in the news will immediately tell you is that there are some very important issues out there in the world, and if you put them too prominently on your front page, your audience will die of boredom. The architecture of news has broken down. It used to be the case that the most important issues came first, and they would attract the biggest audience. And then there might be some frothy stuff at the bottom, but that wouldn't necessarily take up too much of anyone's time. That architecture has broken down. The froth has come to the fore, and nowadays, if you really want a big audience, you put someone like this on. I mean, Taylor always gets huge hits, particularly when she's wearing shorts. This drives serious people crazy, that we're neglecting this for this. What is going on? Have we become degenerates? Well, it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. And if you're feeling gloomy and you're high-minded and you've read Adorno and Wittgenstein, you may take to the hills and you may decide that we have entered an era of unparalleled decadence. I don't despair because I know and I think back to the history of the Renaissance. Now, in the Renaissance, the Catholic Church had some really serious and important things to tell people. How to live according to the Gospels of Jesus Christ. Quite an arduous message. And they thought very hard about how to get that message across. And when they came to painting their very large advertising posters, also known as altarpieces, they did some interesting things. They realized that it's no good if you've got some important truths to say, to put them in the hands of this fellow here. This bearded man, St. Jerome, carrying a heavy book, it's just not that an appealing a figure. I don't mean to single out anybody here, but guys with beards, with heavy truths, are not an appealing sight, generally. If you want to try and get your message across, you've got to go for the Taylor Swifts of the day, which Giovanni Bellini absolutely did. He knew how to do. To put it crudely, we can put it crudely, sex sells. Now, intelligent people, when they hear that, they think, oh, it's just awful. Sex is used to sell everything nowadays. Flights to Florida, chocolate, household goods, etc. What kind of a civilization do we live in? Look, we'll always be very prone to feeling the allure of attractive people. It's not necessarily so bad that sex is used to sell things, but that it's used to sell the wrong things. And this is the problem. Now, the Catholic Church had one solution to this. Arguably, they got sex to be selling the right things. But I'm bringing this up because an epochal challenge that anyone involved in the news nowadays has to face is the collapse of architecture and the blurring of the important and the popular. These two categories which, for a generation, really held steady. What was important was popular. That is no longer the case. That architecture is broken down, and we need to face up to that. And in a way, one of the most popular, one of the most important goals nowadays is popularization. What is popularization? Popularization is the capacity to take a complex and important idea and render it palatable to a wide audience. There is almost no more important skill in the newsroom now than that. But this is not a skill that is normally taught. It's assumed that that's what journalists know how to do. They don't necessarily always, which is why we get these tensions between the Arctic melt and Taylor's legs. Now, I was saying to you that there was too much information, too many stories. The good news is that there are actually not that many stories out there. There's lots and lots of incidents, but if you actually boil down what those incidents really mean, what their emotional core is, what their message is, it's very often the same story. In my book, I say that there are really 32 stories in the news. They just keep going round and round and round. And they keep pretending, because the news will never tell us this. Everything is always new in the news. So it won't tell us that something's already come round. So when there's a crisis in the Ukraine, it's totally new. No one, this has never happened before, except of course it did in 1789, and then again a few decades later. It keeps happening. But the news does not want to alert us because everything's always got to be new. So what we've got to do as the audience is get better at spotting archetypes, because archetypes reduce the number of phenomena and lead you to certain essential noumena, truths that hold together a wide variety of incidents and make them clearer. Look, let me show you let me show you something that looks like 3 stories, but it's only really 1 story. So this is one part of the story, and this is another part of the story, and this is another part of the story. But it looks like lots of stories, but in fact it's only 1 story. And I'll tell you what it's a story about. It's really a story about someone very important doing a quite ordinary thing, and the sight of that ordinary activity in the hands of someone extraordinary produces an emotional charge in the audience, which is very satisfying. So